Wondering how your mindset affects your life? How to bring more energy into your business and life? Millions of people around the world ask these same questions daily. You are in the right place. Learn practices that will help give your life the meaning and success you've been searching for. Welcome to the Charge Podcast, teaching you how to create habits around real goals every day. Practical life advice from those who made it. Here's your host, Gary Wilbers.
Happy New Year! We've started off 2021, and I hope you are ready to make it the year of you. What I mean by that is, you decide each day the choices you make, so you determine your direction. Why do we use GPS or Google Maps? So we know we're headed in the right direction. Let's take control of our life this year and decide to design our life and not live by default. I can't thank you enough. We keep growing our podcast, and we're now in over 68 countries and all 50 states in the United States. Thank you for making the Charge Podcast, and thank you for sharing the podcast with others. We are starting off January of 2021 with some great guests on the Charge Podcast. Our guests this month share their expertise on how to handle stress and anxiety, looking to turn your business over by learning the systems of a successful succession plan, or living in your center to design your life with purpose. Or how about, do you need to create some strategies for financial planning to live a happier life? If you are feeling frustrated and stressed out with your professional or personal life, I know in each of these podcasts, the strategies that each guest shares can propel you to live a charged life in 2021. Chargers are committed to finding how each day they can make their life better by the willingness to learn, grow, and become the person they were meant to be. I think this quote I coined in my new book, Cultivate Positive Culture. Living your life by design allows you not to live it by default. You made a great choice in listening to this podcast. Remember, the podcast is named Charge after my mantra, create habits around real goals every day. Let's get recharged in this podcast to influence a positive culture so you can take simple positive actions each day. Are you ready? Welcome, Chargers. We're glad to have you back for a new year, 2021. It's hard to believe, but it's already here. Now the question is, what are you going to do to make 2021 be successful for you? I'm so excited to bring a guest on today that is a good friend of mine. He's an advisor to closely held agriculture businesses for over 20 years, Lance Woodbury. He works as a member of the Next Gen team to provide an expert level of guidance surrounding long-term planning discussions and decisions to meet both business and family goals. Lance specializes in coaching family businesses as they work through estate and succession planning issues, tackle difficult discussions, and create plans to protect and pass on legacies. Lance brings a robust background in agriculture as a founding partner of Ag Progress, a former leader of Keiko-ism's agribusiness practice, and experience working on his family's farm and ranch in Wichita County, Kansas. He has also served on the board of the Kansas Agriculture and Rural Leadership Program and is a member of the Farm Foundation Roundtable. Lance holds a fellow status with the Family Farm Institute, is a certified Colby consultant, and has facilitated family business discussions throughout the rural United States for over 20 years. He also facilitates several farm and ranch ownership peer groups and writes about family business issues for DTN, The Progressive Farmer. Lance has published 2 books on family business, The Enduring Legacy, Essential Family Business Values and Family Business, Genesis 3750, and The Family of Joseph. Lance founded and continues to operate as an affiliate partner of Keiko-ism, The Progress Coach, a program dedicated to providing ongoing educational sessions for current and future business owners centered on ownership, management, and relationship strategies. Lance, it is great to have you on the Charge Podcast, my friend.
Gary, it's good to be with you. Good to be with you.
Lance and I was in a program together back a few years now. Lance, I don't even want to say how many years for both of our sake. And we got to know each other through this. We were both learning on business and kind of how we could run our businesses better and how can we expand those. And that was a real benefit to us. And it's kind of interesting how we kind of meet back in time as that
That's
comes
right.
back and then come back. And I'm just so glad that you said yes to this podcast today.
Well, glad to do it. And just so you have some reference, that was 2009 when we met, Gary. So a little
that
over,
was a few years ago.
Yeah, about 12, going on 12 years ago. And one other thing we did, I'll just remind you, because it ties into some of this discussion, I think, is that we went to a couples retreat, and your wife and my wife both went to that, and we had dinner one evening and had great conversation.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and we're going to do that again real soon when I get to Kansas, as I told you.
Very good.
Son and daughter at Benedictine, so we're going to get together, so that's going to be great. Well, Lance, I always start out the podcast with this main question. It's my mantra called CHARGE: create habits around real goals every day. What habit do you think has helped you be successful in your career?
Reading. And the reason I say reading, Gary, is that it gives me a reference point to the work I do today. It helps me understand what's happening in the world, and it provides inspiration. I do some writing, and reading others' work gives me ideas about then things I might write about, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But I would say being a reader over my lifetime is been the one habit that really pays dividends over and over and over again. It leads me to speakers, to guests, to potential connections. All kinds of things have happened because I've happened to read a book or read an article or something, and a lot of times I'll get in touch with the author of the book or article, and that turns into a relationship. So it just goes in lots of different directions, but reading has paid many dividends.
Well, I love that one because I've really picked up my reading as I got into this field. I dropped off for a while and I really realized the difference it makes. And I just love this statement. I don't know where it came from. I'm sure multiple sources, but it talks about readers are leaders, leaders are readers.
Yeah.
And that is the key. So 2021, if you're thinking about a habit you want to develop, Chargers, because I've called my audience members Chargers, that is one that you could pick up. And if you could say, well, I just don't read much, then make a goal to read a book a month. And what you'll see, if you pick it up and read 10 pages a day, you can easily get a book a month done, because a 200-page book, that's 20 days. There's 30 days normally, and most months are 31 days. So it gives you that opportunity to do it. So we would challenge you there. Well, Lance, I'm excited about this conversation. As I told you, I've got some clients that have doing some succession planning, and you're in the farm area. But the one thing I think that is so important, what we discussed today, we've already talked a little bit offline. We know these things will apply no matter if you're in a farm operation or if you're in a regular business. So keep that in mind as you're listening, because if you're in one of those business or know someone that's in a business that's looking for succession planning and how are they going to transfer their business, this is a discussion for you. And a lot of our business owners are aging, and we have that thought that's coming up. So how do we make that happen? It's about planning. So I think the first question I really want to start out with you is, what do you think the biggest barriers to family business effectiveness is?
Oh, I think there's sort of two, depending on the situation in any family business, there's usually two elements happening. One is this transition you just mentioned, the handoff from one generation to the next. And that is fraught with all kinds of challenges, but it's a bit of a dance, Gary. And so trying to figure out how people don't step on each other's toes or make wrong moves or things like that. I mean, it's political, it's psychological, it involves conflict, it gets into people's self-identity and self-worth. All kinds of things come up in that transition. So that's one barrier. The other barrier is in a family business when you have siblings working together. And just because we grew up together and we shared a room and we spent all that time together doesn't mean that you can't, you got to listen to me, and we got to treat each other as professional business partners when we're in business together. But it's hard to do that if they've grown up as a family and you're sort of burdened with all these assumptions that you have from wearing the family hat. So if you think about different hats to wear, you wear a family hat, you wear a manager hat, and you wear an owner hat. And those three hats get very confused and conflicted in a family business. So that second area is probably just the relationships among family members and particularly siblings in a family business. That's a barrier.
Yeah. And I could see that becomes a barrier because the thing is, in a family business, they're around each other all the time. So we just got done with the holidays, and I hope everyone got to spend time with their family. And we spent that time with each other in that setting where it's a more of a social family setting.
Right.
And then you go right back and you're in the business setting all the time, because running a farm or running any type of business is a business.
I remember one family member, I was helping a family have a conversation probably 7 or 8 years ago. And finally, one of the daughters spoke up to her family and said, look, I love you, but we're in the business every day together. We go to the same church. All our kids are similar ages, so we see each other at all these birthday parties and graduations and all this stuff. She goes, I love you, but I need a break. I need a boundary. I need a boundary. And I know you've probably are familiar with Dr. Henry Cloud, who's a Christian psychologist, and wrote a book he wrote several books, but one of the books he wrote was called Boundaries. And it's about how do you establish those kind of boundaries when you're working together in a family business. And it's hard because when you say, hey, I love you, but I need a boundary like that, it feels like, oh man, we got conflict, or that's offensive or something. But we all need our space, so to speak. And it's hard to find that in a family business when you're living next to each other and working next to each other and going to church next to each other. And, it's just tough.
Yeah. And I've read before, one of the oldest studies from Harvard, it was a 75-year-old study when I read that, was talking about one of the things we need is those connections, the others. And of course, we have a connection with our family and we want that connection, but we also thrive to have that connection to others. And actually, to keep people living longer, they show that the more people they're connected to, those relationships, the longer it makes the longer you're able to live. The studies show that. Well, I think one of the things we have to talk about here, because with a family business, one of the things that comes up, and you've kind of mentioned that, is we're always working together, is sometimes that conflict. So how do we work to resolve some of that conflict that comes up? And it comes up in a regular business too. So let people know that if you're a family business, don't think you're unique because it's a family business. It's a little bit different aspect, but it's still conflict is in the workplace.
I sometimes joke, Gary, that a dysfunctional family is one that gets along all the time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So
if there's no conflict, there's, somebody's lying to me if they tell me their family business has no conflict. I'm like, I've never not seen conflict in a family business. So yes, normalizing it is important. I would say in terms of resolving the conflict, I boil it down. So I have a background in conflict resolution. So I end up doing a lot of mediation work where we're trying to help conflicting parties in a family business figure out how to go forward together. And the question that has become what I would call my magic question when you have a couple people in conflict is I ask them, what do you need to see or hear from the other party in order to feel good about moving forward? What do you need to see or hear from the other party in order to feel good about moving forward? And see and hear, the word see and hear, see gets at behavior. What behavior do you need to see from the other party? And hear gets at what do you need the other party to say? And sometimes that's an apology, or I'm sorry, or sometimes it's forgiveness or other things. But what do you need to see or hear in order to feel good about moving forward together? And the whole moving forward point is to say, look, we got to talk about our future relationship, because this conflict has gotten us to where we are today. But if we don't spend time talking about how we move forward, then we'll get sort of mired in the past and what went on. And you got to respect the past, and there's reasons things happen and whatnot. But the real future, the real opportunity is in the future, and saying, how do we go forward? How do you and I go forward together? And if we can get on the same page about that, it really can set a new tone for the family business. And is the question ultimately, when you get through all the mediation, gobbledygook and process stuff and everything else. To me, it boils down to what do we need to see or hear from each other in order to feel good about moving forward.
Do you see when you ask that question that sometime you get the surface level answers to start?
Yes.
And then is about kind of peeling away that onion?
Absolutely. So what does that mean? Or say more about this, or I'm curious about, or what would that look like? All those sort of open-ended questions you ask to try and really dig in to say, what does it really mean to see a behavioral change in your family member / business partner? What's that look like? And it could be new communication skills, or it, could be the way we make decisions together. But you start talking about, hey, how do things need to change? And if people do a good job of listening together, and that's my role as a third party, if people do a good job of listening to one another in that process, oftentimes they feel heard in ways that they've not feel heard before. And it's not because there's nothing magic about what I'm doing. It's just the fact that I'm a third party asking the question. So they sort of respect me a little differently than they respect each other. And I can ask questions that they might not be willing to ask each other, or when they do ask them, they're full of assumptions.
Yeah. Now, I'm a big Franklin Covey guy, so it really fits in with habit 5. Seek first to understand.
Absolutely. Yep.
Then to be understood. And it's
Exactly
really
right.
trying to understand each other in that conflict, in that conversation, versus here's my point. Because
that's right.
Let's be honest, normally we come from conflict from our point of view.
Yeah. I sometimes say there's another couple of frameworks on communication, but one of the things I like to tell people is, when you feel heard, that's sort of one thing, but if you feel felt, that's another thing. And what I mean by that is, if you can articulate, this is probably one of the big listening tips I give to people. Listening is not just about restating what the other person said or even paraphrasing what the other person said. I mean, that helps, that goes a long way. But if you can capture the emotion with which they told you that statement, oh, you sound angry, or Gary, you sound enthusiastic about that, or you sound scared, or you sound fearful, or whatever, that sort of is a big light bulb to folks. Say, hey, this person's listening to me because they get how I'm feeling. And if you can reflect the emotion that you're hearing, and people sense that, I mean, the connection you get with another person is almost electric at some level, right? Yeah. And if you get it wrong, like if you say, well, boy, you sound angry, they'll tell you. You can't kind of miss on this stuff, because if you get it wrong, they'll say, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, or I'm not angry, I'm frustrated. You know what I mean? Yep. They'll clarify it. And even then you've got a big, because they sense you were trying to understand how they felt. So again, it's not just feeling heard, it's feeling felt. And if you can do that, man, you're off to the races with good communication skills.
Well, that's valuable. So if you're thinking, okay, you don't have a family business and you're still listening, you just got the golden tip right there. Because anytime
it's
you're
useful all the time.
If you're a leader and you're dealing with teenagers, you're dealing with children, if you're dealing with your spouse, if you're dealing with, a coworker, right there, that works there yet in each one of those examples. So I appreciate you sharing that, because that is so true, because it becomes truly empathic listening. You're really getting the emotion that they're feeling. And that's where people want to start, because that allows them to open up and allows them to share a lot more with each other to move forward.
That's right.
Well, one of the challenges, I'm sure, and I know it happens in family businesses, especially on family farms, because I think I've told you, Lance, my mother and father-in-law have a family farm, and 2 of the brothers are home on the farm. And what we see is, a lot of times is of course, they've got so much work to do, just like in a regular business, that a business owner gets in, they're working in the business all the time. But how do you back up and work on the business?
Yeah. You have to carve out, or they have to carve out some time for communication. And I often say that communication is hard work in the family business. And it's similar hard work to the work we do on the farm every day. It's just different hard work, right? So you have to carve out. And I often tell them that communication in the family business, or in the family farm or ranch, is sort of like the oil in the engine. You don't see it. You don't see the oil running through the engine, sort of. But like when it's not there, the engine freezes up, right? When you're out of oil, the engine's frozen. And I think it's that way in the family business, that you may not see all the communication running through, but man, you sure miss it when it's not there, because the family business freezes up and there's lots of conflict and people are stuck. So the most important practice, Gary, is to get them to carve out some time to talk as a family. And again, it's hard because, first of all, they think, well, we're a family. We should know what each other thinks. We shouldn't have to carve out time to communicate because we all know, we grew up together. We've been together 50 years. We know what each other's thinking. So why do we have to go communicate? And the other is just finding a time and a place to get everybody, particularly on a farm, because everybody's wearing lots of hats and everybody's busy all the time, to like, hey, we got to shut down for 2 hours and go have this conversation. Like, man, that feels terribly inefficient when we're supposed to be all about efficiency. But back to 7 Habits. I mean, that's kind of sharpening the saw, right? I mean, that communication that's going on is actually making them more effective when they get back into the business. So if they can create a habit around communication as a family, it doesn't have to be, we go spend 3 days a month communicating in a meeting. It can be, hey, 2 hours once a week or 2 hours every 2 weeks or something. But that habit of communication and just forcing them to do that is what needs to happen.
Yeah, and that becomes so true because in all businesses, we see it all the time. Business owners work hard in their business. I have a mastermind group. And when they come in, of course, their whole number one reason that they won't join, it's normally not price.
Yeah, it's time.
I don't know if I have the time.
Yeah.
Because we meet once a month for 4 hours, allowing them to do it. And normally what I see, and I just had some go through that just became involved in our group over the last several months, is they say, wow, how valuable this is, because they're looking at their business differently. And It doesn't matter. Same thing happens into a family-owned business. You've got to step back some from the business to be able to see that wider view and have that communication that you're talking about there each and every day. I think one of the challenges we always get in is navigating being in the business with people who are family. Of course, we've been talking about that, but who are kind of like family to me. So how do we kind of bridge that gap with our communication and some of the things we've discussed?
Yeah. It's about, I think, Gary, the question of who should be at the table when you're talking about this stuff becomes pretty important. And even though we're in a family business, in family businesses that have been operating for a long time, you have employees or staff, team members who are just like family members. You also have in-laws who are family members, but they bring a different communication style or maybe a different history of how they handle conflict. And you got to figure out ways to get them to the table in some way to participate in the communication. So I don't know. I mean, I would, you might treat differently the topics that you raise depending on who's around the table. But the idea of including, here's my ground rule. I always include anyone who can throw a wrench in what we're about to come up with. And if that's a key employee, if that's an in-law or a spouse or something, if they can screw it up, I'm going to figure out a way to include them in the communication process, because that ability to throw a wrench in our plans as a family business, that's a form of power. And we won't go into it here, but if you dig deep, you got to understand the sources of power people have. And one of the sources of power is the ability to create chaos. We tend to think power is about money, or power is about who has the title president in the corporate documents or other things. But power, really, an element of power is who has the power to create chaos in our lives. And you start thinking about a business, and there's a key employee or two. If they wanted to mess things up, they probably could. Or if my brother's wife or my sister's husband wanted to mess things up, they probably could. So I'm going to figure out a way to get them involved in the process somehow.
I thought, I haven't asked you this, but I'm going to ask you and see if you're okay with it, is don't, of course, give any names or who it is, but can you share an example of where you had some of that conflict, some of that chaos, and how it turned out and how you were able to kind of work through the situation? Because I know we're talking about those, but sometimes a practical example, and I don't care if it's a combination of a couple, but where, you worked with a group and then at the end, kind of that end result of where you was able to get to.
Yeah. I've worked on a number of cases where you've got the proverbial black sheep in the family. Mm-hmm. And that's not an uncommon sort of position in the family. And the way I work through that, Gary, is they need to be included in the process in the way that they may not be able to participate in a meeting very effectively, but I might spend a lot of time communicating with them one-on-one by phone or spending time with them. Okay. And I, as a third party, I use that way to make sure that they are getting their thoughts into the process. And it takes a lot of time relationally, but they have to sort of learn to trust me over time that I'm working for the benefit of everybody. I'm not working against them, not working for the others. I'm like working for the whole. But so spending that time and so taking the proverbial black sheep and spending time with them, oftentimes they don't feel heard or understood, or their points aren't getting, brought forth. So I just spend a lot of time, almost a disproportionate amount of time. If you looked at the time I spend with everybody, I might spend more time actually with the person who's the furthest out on the circle, so to speak.
Sure.
And that's a form of balancing the power a little bit, but I spend more time with them to make sure that they feel like they're getting their thoughts into the process, because their normal way of engaging creates too much conflict. So I find a different way to engage them. And that has led to, I end up in some cases, Gary, people always think, how do we keep the family business going? My probably biggest message to people who own family businesses is sometimes you shouldn't keep the family business going. Meaning sometimes the right answer for the benefit of the family is to stop being business partners. Yeah. And when a family will admit that it's time to stop being business partners, they actually become a little better family after they get split up out of business. So I end up actually facilitating the breakup of some family businesses. And when I do that, and you've got all that conflict and the black sheep and other things, that, if I can help them communicate well, it avoids the cost of multiple attorneys trying to split things up and go into court, saves the family hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Not that I'm cheap, but I'm not as expensive as 4 attorneys billing at the same time for 4 different parties, right? So that spending that time is an investment with each party, and particularly when there's quite a bit of conflict with somebody who's on the outside of the circle a little bit, and that usually helps get the deal done. And it doesn't work all the time, but most of the time we can get the family business figured out or split up in a way that saves a bit of the family relationship and saves them a lot of money.
Yeah. Great. I'm glad you shared that, and I'm glad I kind of asked that, because I think that's the thing people have to realize. Sometimes it's not always the best. And it really kind of comes to my last question before we jump to the recharge round that I really wanted to ask you is, most family businesses, especially family farms, because you see the century farms and all those signs that come up and how big a deal that is to families, but it's also for a regular business that people want to ensure that legacy. So what do they do to really ensure their legacy of their business?
Well, let me just say that sometimes people make the mistake and think legacy is only about the financial side of things. And I try and help them, first of all, define legacy a bit broader than just financial. So your legacy isn't the business. It is the business you leave, but it's also the wisdom that you leave. It's the relationships that you leave. It's the values that you pass on to future generations. Somebody told me one time, they said, when you think about the last will and testament of someone, they said it ought to be called the last testament and will, because if you think about testament or testimony, as it were, you say, hey, here's sort of what I believe, or here's how I came to believe what I believe. That's how we think about it in a spiritual or religious context. Well, if you think about last will and testament, you ought to put in the front of the will, hey, here's my belief. Here's what I want to leave you with. And then here's where all the money goes. And so if we can think about it as a testament to others, legacy then becomes much more than money. It becomes values, it becomes life lessons, it becomes wisdom, it becomes relationships. So that would be my point about legacy.
Well, that is a wonderful way to kind of set it up. And really, we could go a lot deeper, but I wanted to kind of give that overview. And I think it's more than an overview about if you have a family business, what's some of your challenges if you're really looking at passing that on to the next generation. And I think this gives you some tools that's there. Lance, I know you've got a website. Would you share that? Because if they want to go to some of your readings and some of the articles that you've created, I looked at your website, you got a lot of great information there.
You bet. Just lancewoodbury.com. So LanceWoodbury.com will get you to my articles and books and a way to reach me if you need to reach me.
And I know you may be exercising because it's the new year and you've made that new challenge, that goal for yourself to get in better shape. So if you're doing that, remember, you can always go to chargepodcast.com. We will have those notes in there and Lance's website where you can easily click on it to be able to reach that. So know that's available to you. So if you're wondering about the spelling or you're driving right now, we don't want you trying to write that down. We want you listening on that part of it. Now we're going to go to the recharge round and I'm going to shoot Lance our 6 questions that I ask every guest. And as all of you know, if you're a new listener to the program, these are questions that are kind of part of my framework that I share with my message when I go out to speak. So my first one to you, Lance, how do you believe your mindset affects your daily living?
Well, Gary, the idea of progress over perfection keeps moving me forward. And that is the idea that as long as you are better than you were yesterday, you're moving in the right direction. And you'll know this concept of the gap, that if you always compare yourself to where you think you should be, you'll always fall short, right? Because you never reach the horizon. The horizon's always out in front of you. So progress over perfection sort of informs how I look at every day. Am I getting a little bit better today than I was yesterday? Am I making a little more progress today than I was yesterday?
Super. We are in that winter time, but what do you do to bring energy into your life each and every day?
You mentioned exercise earlier, and I would say that's the energetic piece for me. So whether it's I like to ride my bicycle. So I have an indoor trainer. So when it's, these winter months, when it's chillier outside and there's not as much light, getting on that trainer and riding. And it's good not only for my health, but like I said about reading earlier, it causes different things, this, to sort of go off in your brain and you make connections and you get ideas and other things. That's just really powerful. So I would say exercise.
That's where you have a voice app so you can easily put it down, because my problem is if I wait till I get off, I'll forget it.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So share the number one connection or relationship that's made the biggest impact on your life.
In the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, I joined an organization called the Farm Foundation Roundtable. And it's a group of about 150 leaders in the agriculture industry. And they come together to be educated. It's a non-political or apolitical organization, but there are these really long periods of networking at their meetings, which unfortunately we can't have in the pandemic sort of time as much. But I have met so many wonderful people through the Farm Foundation Roundtable that I've just enjoyed connections with and building relationships with. So when you find a group of like-minded people, the multiple connections. So that's maybe a little different than what you asked. It's not one person, it's a relationship with an organization, but that has led to all kinds of connections and opportunities and chances to get to know people.
Well, I think it fits because the thing is, no matter what type of business you're in, or even maybe you're not the business owner, you have that capability to find organizations that can give you that in networking, socials, in a lot of different atmospheres. And going into 2021 with it being this time, what a great thing to really look at. Are you? Because it's more than just showing up to work. It's about how can you really expand that network? Gives you so many opportunities. I mean, look, 2009 is when we were last together. And it's now 2021, and Lance and I are doing a podcast together.
That's right.
Those become relationships. And it was kind of interesting because I looked him up for another gentleman that was looking for someone in the farm industry to be able to share with him. And that's when I looked Lance back up and I said, I got to get you on my podcast. So those become relationships that don't stop.
Yeah.
What advice has influenced you the most in your life?
I would say the CEO of Keiko, the firm that I'm in today, the CEO that hired me was just had lots of wisdom, but ultimately the advice was spend time developing relationships with people, with your clients. Don't look at your clients just as a business asset. Spend time developing relationships with people. And I've done that. And what's happened because of that advice, Gary, is I don't have very many clients that I haven't worked with over multiple years, or even now multiple generations, going on 25 years with some of these folks. I helped them transition the business once, and now we're at it again. And it's because I saw those as very long-term relationships, not as a project. A client is not a project. A client is a relationship. And that advice has served me well.
That's an excellent one. Now, I know this one's going to be tough because you already told us a habit. You're a reader.
Yes.
What's one book that you would share, and why do you love it?
Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute. And I don't know if you've read that. It's a bit of a fable. And Gary, that's like your book has the first part of your book is a bit of a sort of business fable. Leadership and Self-Deception is really about the blind spots that we have as leaders. And that is, when I see that in family business all the time. I mean, if you're not self-aware of your own strengths and weaknesses and how you impact other people, you ain't going nowhere in life. Or you may go somewhere, but it won't be very pretty. And so that whole idea of don't deceive yourself about what your strengths and weaknesses and your impact on others is, and it's encapsulated in the book, Leadership and Self-Deception.
Yeah, great book. I've read that one, and anything comes out from the Arbinger Institute, I'd highly recommend for you.
Yeah.
My last sentence to you. We talked about legacy for family farms. What legacy does Lance want to leave with the world?
Relationships. As I work with people, Gary, and you come to understand what's important to people at the end of life, the acres don't matter. What I mean by that is the pursuit of building a big business, whether you measure it in dollars, whether you measure it in acres, whether you measure it in head of livestock. When you get to the end, the question is, what kind of relationships am I leaving behind? What kind of relationships do I have with people? So that for me, it's about, the money's important from a business perspective, but I have met lots of people who are not happy at the end of the day because they chase the money and not the relationships, and relationships with other people, relationships with God. I mean, those are that's what's important. It's not about the money.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because that really kind of sets a great stage, because we're early in 2021, and, we were challenged in 2020 of having those relationships. I think people that found unique ways, because you can do it via Zoom, reconnect with people. I gave people during the pandemic a challenge early on in April, telling them to connect with 5 people a day. So what I want to do is give our chargers kind of this challenge. This next week, connect with 5 people after you've listened to this, and really connect with them. It can be a phone call. I would not recommend a text or an email. I'm talking about either a phone call or set up a Zoom call, or if you can in person, then make that connection there. Because we've seen through studies, we talked about earlier, the Harvard study, that makes the difference in life. That's how Lance and I have this relationship still, because we go back to that time when we had that connection. And that you have to put yourself out there to be able to make that happen. So that's my challenge I give the Chargers. Lance, I can't thank you enough. So what some great nuggets and great information really starting off the new year. I really wanted you to share again your website, if you would, and also talk just a little bit about your 2 books so they know what to expect there.
So again, the website is lancewoodbury.com. And if you just Google Lance Woodbury, there are 4 or 5 of us in the U.S., but usually I come pretty close to the top of the list. So you can just Google my name and get there. The 2 books, one was about just the values that I saw that in successful family businesses. And that book is called The Enduring Legacy. And both these books are on Amazon. The other one is about the story of Joseph in the Bible and the family business lessons that we can draw from that story, and it's a wonderfully rich. I know, a lot of listeners will know that story, but it's just wonderfully rich. And so we take different parts of the story and say, hey, what does this mean for people who have to work together every day as family members? And the next book I'm working on is one where we do that with Jacob and Esau. So we go back a generation, right, to Jacob, and look at that relationship with Esau and say, man, there's a lot of wisdom in the Bible about how we think about family business today. So working on that book next.
Super. I'm excited. Can't wait till that comes out. You let us know and we'll share it with our audience. Lance, again, thank you very much. Again, it's one of these, it's so fun to have friends on the podcast, and I consider you a friend, and I'm so glad we've reconnected, and I can't wait to get up there to have dinner with you one evening.
Hey, we'll look forward to it. Yeah.
Super. Well,
who both are named Dana, by the way.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we do have that in common. So Chargers, I hope you found the value out of this. In 2021, what are you going to do? We've given you a challenge. The challenge is the next week, over the next 7 days, reach out to 5 people, either via phone, via Zoom, or go see them and have that conversation with them and connect and have that relationship, continue that relationship you have there. Now, if you're in a business, we've given you lots of steps to look at. You're going to have to go back and maybe re-listen to this where you can truly take some notes on, because it doesn't matter if it's a family farm business or it's a family business. Lance gave you some steps that you really need to consider. But I think the biggest one I'd share with you is start the communication. Is the communication strong? Because you got to ask those tough questions. You've got to be able to get through that to be able to make that happen. And really, that's the same in business. You have to have that communication. If you're a leader and you're leading staff, it's about your communication. And normally in every study, it says that they don't get enough communication. So as a leader, I want you to think this year, how can I increase my communication to my staff? Lance, again, thank you very much. Charger, come back next week. Remember, like and review us on whatever platform you're listening to us, because that allows more people to see and hear our podcast. So we're so glad you're here today. I'll see you back here next week. Make it a great day. We have our first sponsor of the Charge podcast. We welcome Pulse Hit to our show, and we want you to check out their services. Most companies don't have time for a wellness program. Pulse Hit is your mobile turnkey wellness solution to guide your employees to a healthier lifestyle. Support your team in achieving their full potential so you can go back to running your business. Check them out on their website at PulseHit, PulseHiit.com, PulseHit.com. And if you can't check that out, go to our show notes at chargepodcast.com and we'll have you a link to their website. Thanks for joining me. Here we go.
This podcast is ended, but your life doesn't just stop. To continue your inspiring journey, head over to chargepodcast.com and access all the tools and resources mentioned on today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with somebody who may also benefit from the advice provided. That's chargepodcast.com. Until next time, charge in business and life.